Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is remote viewing the future. With me is Stephen Schwartz, an expert remote viewer, researcher. He is a founder of the International Remote Viewing Association, also a founder of the Society for the Anthropological Study of Consciousness. He is the author of many books, including The Secret Vaults of Time and the Alexandria Project, both dealing with remote viewing into the past. Another book of his is Opening to the Infinite and the Eight Laws of Change. Welcome, Stephen. You're mostly known for your work looking at the past in remote viewing, archaeological research, I think.
I think that's probably true.
Really where you made your mark in the world, but you've done remote viewing into the distant future, into the year 2050.
Yes.
And that's what we're going to focus on now.
I came out of 6 years as the editor of one of the major magazines, journals about maritime and naval affairs, and then
Sea Power,
and then as the special assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations, and then I did some work for the NSC and
NSC meaning
National Security Council. And out of that, this is back in the early 70s, came a real concern that nuclear war was not only possible, but had a certain degree of probability. I mean, people don't think so much about it now, but at that time, and particularly in the military intelligence world, geopolitical world, that was a real issue.
Well, when I was in elementary school, we were all taught, if there's a nuclear war, we're going to hide under our desks.
Yes, exactly. I'm not quite sure what the point was, but in any case, so yes, there was this really strong concern.
Mm-hmm. People were building fallout shelters. It was a huge fad.
Yes. This was the height of the Cold War, and it was really quite scary.
Yeah.
And so, as you have said, I'm one of the founders of remote viewing, and I thought, although I had been originally interested in archaeological remote viewing, I thought, well, I don't see any reason why you couldn't do this with the future. And the question was, well, how far into the future you can go? Not because you're limited by the remote viewing, but because you wouldn't be able to understand what they were saying. And I thought about that, and I thought, well, if I go too far into the future, I won't understand what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not that they can't do it, but that I won't understand what it means.
Yeah.
So I thought, I spent several weeks thinking about this, and my idea was, really, to be honest, is there a nuclear war?
Mm-hmm.
So I finally settled on the year 2050. And in 1978, I started getting people to do remote viewings of the same date, in the year 2050.
Mm-hmm.
And I continued from 1978 to 1996.
In a particular location or?
Wherever they were.
Okay.
And I did this in Russia, Germany, France, Jamaica, Mexico, Canada, the United States. I had scientists, engineers, government bureaucrats, housewives, doctors. Whenever I would go to a conference, I would get either the whole conference or individuals to do this experiment.
So they weren't pre-selected for talent?
Not at all.
Mm-hmm.
No. Well, I've been doing remote viewing research for almost half a century now. I mean, I started in 1968, called it distant viewing, and I knew that the ability to do it is spread through the population like any skill.
Mm-hmm.
There's a few people that are really gifted, there's a few people that don't get it, and most of us are in the middle.
Yeah.
And since I have always worked on a consensus methodology, I knew that if I got a whole bunch of people to do it, that patterns would emerge in the data. Now, some of these patterns are cultural. There are cultural motifs, memes, maybe that's the best word, that influence remote viewing data, and there are also personal biases. But overall, it would be very much like outside of this studio if we heard a large explosion and we ran out and there was a group of people. What would we do? Well, you'd take people aside one by one. What did you see? What did you see? What did you see? Same thing policemen do. Same thing intelligence agents do. Same thing anthropologists do. So I thought, well, if I get enough people to do this, there will be dominant memes that will emerge.
And I presume there were.
And indeed there were. And it was not at all what I thought. So a typical one would be, Jeff, I'd like you to go forward in time to the same date as today. In the year 2050, you're standing in front, you are life-size, that's important. You're standing in front of the place where you sleep. Now, the thing about remote viewing is you must ask the questions in ways that do not cue a particular response. So I don't say, I want you to stand in front of your house where you sleep, or your apartment where you sleep, because maybe in 2050 they don't have houses and apartments.
Yeah.
Maybe everybody lives in dorms. I don't know. So I said, you're life size. It's the same date as today, only it's the year 2050. You're standing in front of the house where you live, or excuse me, where the place where you sleep.
Yeah.
I'd like you to describe for me its exterior. And you would do that. And then I would say, all right, I'd like you to enter this structure. Again, notice I don't say house, I don't say apartment, I don't say co-op. I'd like you to enter this structure, and you're standing in the first space that you enter when you go through the door.
So I'm a little confused already, because does it mean they're in the place where they sleep currently, or
No.
it presumes they're going to be
Same date in the year 2050.
Well, what if-
Not you. Not you.
But who?
Because my presumption was, because I believe that reincarnation is a valid area of research. Now, by the way, about 12% of people say, well, I'm not incarnate.
And of course, a lot of people, when you did this study, was decades ago. So 2050 was further.
Yeah, 1978 to 2050 was a long time.
Right.
Yeah, not quite 100 years. Yes.
I mean, it's 33 years for us now.
Yeah,
It's-
but then it was almost
there,
right?
right?
Yeah, almost a century. Well, we'll get to that in a second, because that turns out to be quite interesting.
Yeah.
About 12% of the people said, I'm not incarnate. And so I was completely unprepared for that. And so I then said, because once I had heard it, all right, I want you to go to someone who you feel empathetic with, and I want you to see all this through their eyes. And I want you to describe them for me.
Okay.
But let's keep going just where we are. So, okay, you go to the place where you sleep. Go through the rooms. Describe them for me. Go into is food prepared in the place where you are? Go to that place. Describe for me what you see. Is there a place where food is stored? You say yes. Can you access that? You notice I don't say open. Can you access that? Yes. All right, please do so. What do you see? What does it smell like? What colors are prominent? Are there shapes that are particularly important? Go to the place where you sleep. What does that look like? Then we go through that whole thing. Then I would say, all right, I now would like you to go to the place where you spend your waking hours. And you're standing outside of it. You're life size. Please describe it for me. Now, I would like you to enter that place. What do you see? And in that way, we would go through the whole thing. I would like you to go to a place where there is an acquisition of material goods. What does that look like? How do you pay for it? I'd like you to go to a place where health care is offered. What does that look like? And all of that. So we go through the whole course of that. So that's a typical 2050 remote viewing session.
Very good.
I don't cue anybody about anything. I have no anticipation about what they're going to say. Anyway, as with the remote viewing in the archaeology work, or most of my remote viewing work, not all of it, because I did a whole bunch of just single in-session laboratory studies, but in any case, my applications work is all consensual. As with that consensual work, just like, as I said, if there was an explosion outside of this studio, we ran out and interviewed people. If we reconstructed collectively, not everybody would see everything. Not everything they said would be right. We know, for instance, that from other studies that men would be more likely to be able to give you the name of the car brand, but women would be more likely to get the color right. So there are gender issues. There's a perceptual psychology. There are a lot of issues at work here. Anyway, so I took all of this data, transcribed it, broke it down into its concepts, so that if I said the man sitting in the chair with the tweed jacket, that's 5 concepts, not just a sentence. So we're talking about large masses of data, and then you need computers to do this, and then you start processing it. Well, what came out was not at all what I expected. First thing, let me say this is the headline, the takeaway. Every major consensual trend that the remote viewers from 78 to 96 described have come true.
Already?
Well, because when they would say, oh, well, this is a result of something that happened 10 years ago, then I would say, well, explain that to me. So, first thing that just completely freaked me out, because I was thinking in terms of Cold War, right? We're going to have a nuclear war. So the first thing I said was, is there a nuclear war? No. I said, oh, well, is the world safer? No, the world is much more dangerous. I thought, why is the world much more dangerous? So I said, why is the world more dangerous? Because of terrorism. Religious terrorism becomes a dominant activity in the 21st century. I never thought about that. 1978, we weren't worrying about religious terrorists. We didn't even think about them. So, second thing, well, who are the major forces at that time in 2050? Well, the Soviet Union has disappeared. And I heard that over and over again, and I thought, what in the world are they talking about? What, Martians came down and ripped the land up and took it away? I mean, literally, I would read this stuff. I'd be sitting in my lab reading, the Soviet Union has disappeared. What in the hell does that mean? Well, of course, now it seems very clear. At the time, we saw the Soviet Union as this great monolithic force in the world. It never occurred to anybody, and I can say this as a person who made his living doing geopolitical analysis. Nobody ever in 1978 thought the Soviet Union was going to disappear. It disappeared. So to go back, the world is much more dangerous because of terrorism. Completely unprepared for that. Well, what other threats occur? Oh, there are epidemics. Could you describe one of those epidemics for me? Well, the first one is a blood disease that comes out of Africa that crosses over from primates to humans and then spreads over the world and kills millions of people. So I listened to this in 1978, 1979, early 1980, and I go to a friend of mine who is with the NIH, who's a hematologist, and I say to him, do you know anything about a blood disease that crosses over from primates that spreads, it's going to spread all over the world and kill millions of people? No, nothing. We don't know anything about that. 1981, the first reports of AIDS come out.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So that's AIDS.
Mm-hmm.
No anticipation of that at all. When I would talk about how people travel, they would say, well, actually, people don't travel that much in long distances. Why not? Well, because they don't allow airplanes to fly as much because the emissions from the planes do something to the atmosphere.
Mm.
That hasn't happened yet, but you already see in discussions of climate change arguments about, are we going to have to limit air travel? I said, well then, if people can't travel long distance or don't frequently do it, how do they do it? They said, oh, well, you put on this kind of apparatus, and in this apparatus you can project yourself into this, well, I don't know how to describe it. It's like a virtual reality, only all of your senses report, and you have meetings in there. And so that's how people do it. They don't physically do it. They do it in this kind of electronic space.
Yep.
And of course, we see that coming. I have been interested in low energy nuclear reactions as a result of the 2050 because I was concerned already, even in 1978, with carbon energy.
You're talking about what is sometimes called cold fusion.
Cold fusion, yes. LENR. And so what got me interested in it was people said to me, well, they don't burn carbon anymore, or not very much. There's still a little of it, but not very much. And I said, well, then I want you to go to a place where some conveyance exists that would permit you to move locally. Again, not a car, not a bicycle, some place where a conveyance exists that will allow you to move locally. How is it powered? Oh, well, you don't buy a car, you buy a chassis, and then you buy a superstructure that bolts onto it, and you buy a kind of box that powers it. And I said, well, what's the box? Well, I don't know. It looks kind of simple. It gets warm but not hot. It produces more power than it takes. I can't quite describe for you how it works, but you buy a little one to drive a car, you buy a bigger one to power your house, and an even bigger one to do a whole building. And that got me interested in LENR, and I've been following that research ever since.
It's been controversial, but it looks like they're making progress.
Well, SRI reports that they're making progress. Mitsubishi reports they're making progress, so we're going to see. But in any case, and we also now see, I just read a paper just a few days ago about how they're going to manufacture chassis, and then you can put whatever kind of car body you want on top of it.
How interesting.
So, as I say, the interesting thing about this 2050 research is that every trend they predicted, where there was strong consensus, those have all happened. The demise of the Soviet Union, disappearance of the Soviet Union, AIDS, the rise of terrorism. Healthcare. Again, 78, 80, 81, 82, 85, 87, 88, 90. Well, I would say I want you to go to a place where health care is provided. I would like you to go inside. What do you see? Well, it's very natural looking. And I said, okay, if a person were to have an infection, what would they do? Oh, well, they don't do it the way that we do it now. Why not? Well, antibiotics don't seem to work anymore.
And we are watching that trend.
We are watching that trend happen, the collapse of antibiotic medicine. A person just died a few weeks ago of a superbug that no antibiotic would deal with.
Yes, that was in the news. It was a big story. Mm-hmm.
And we see this whole demise of antibiotic medicine. But again, 78 to 96, I'm hearing people talk about the demise of antibiotics. So what are you talking about? So the demise of antibiotic medicine. Climate change. Big deal on climate change. Oh, well, in some places you have to live under a dome. Now remember, I did this same experiment in multiple countries with all kinds of people. They all tell the same story.
Mm-hmm. Were there social trends?
Social trends. Gender equality. Marriage equality. A redefinition of gender identity. LGBT.
Yep, we're seeing that.
You know, from gay to LGBT. Demise of antibiotics, let's see. Energy, the energy I mentioned. Some people in places like Las Vegas, where we are now, living under domes because the heat is too great, and because water issues become very important. In fact, I developed and have been working on a whole line of research on what I think of as water is destiny, which I'd never thought about. Oh, that people have moved away from the coast. I did a whole series of these things. I did some of them in California, and I did another whole bunch of them in North Carolina and down in Florida, for instance. And I was just stunned. I was in Miami speaking at a conference, and I had 50 volunteers. I said I want to do this experiment, and over the course of this week that we're doing this conference, I'd like to interview you. And I did them individually, and they said, oh, well, this hotel doesn't exist anymore. In fact, Florida doesn't exist anymore.
They told you that?
Yeah. Why? I said, what do you mean Florida doesn't exist anymore? Oh, well, it's underwater.
Yeah.
Now, I did not become aware of climate change until 1991. I read a study in American Scientist in July, I think it was July of 1991, about ice coring and climate change issues. That was the first time I really became aware of it. So in the 70s and 80s when I was doing this, I didn't know anything about climate change. That Florida disappears? What do you mean it disappears? Well, it's underwater. No longer carbon power. The United States. The United States, there have been huge schisms in the United States, and although the federal structure still exists, that is the basic, the three branches of government, the real power has devolved down to states and bioregions. I'd never thought about bioregions.
Yeah.
But if you look, again, you can see this all happening.
You certainly can.
If you look at Oregon, Washington, California, a natural bioregion, that this is already happening. Drugs, 70, 80, when I had been special assistant to CNO, one of the big concerns was marijuana.
CNO, Chief of Naval Operations,
for Elmo Zumwalt, and then Jim Holloway, who followed him. So marijuana was a huge deal. Turned out it really wasn't. Alcoholism with senior enlisted and senior officers was the real problem. But we were obsessed with marijuana. And so I said, well, what about drugs, illegal drugs? Oh, marijuana's legal. I could not conceive of it. I couldn't even conceive of it. I said, what? Oh, yes, you can go into a store and buy it. How do you pay? No currency. You pay with like a card, but a card that has information in it that attests to who you are. You have now been issued a card. They don't have passports anymore. You have a kind of card that has some sort of thing that contains, of course you see this, that contains biometric information. The currency still exists, but isn't used much and has become rather odd.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that.
Yeah.
Virtual reality, already mentioned that.
Yeah.
The structure of the world that they describe. Oh, a final one, which you can also see, that real power has evolved to basically virtual corporate states.
Mm-hmm.
And they now own governments.
Mm-hmm.
So although the form of government continues, the real substance of power has transferred. I was, as you can imagine, doing the analysis of this. I was bewildered, very glad I hadn't gone further than 2050, because when they talked about what I now think is LENR, I couldn't understand what they were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
When they were talking about virtual reality, I could only dimly figure out what that was. The way of payment, that there was some sort of card and had all your information in it, and that you got this card at birth, and that they changed the information as you grew, so everything was on this card.
Mm-hmm.
I said, you mean like information about education? Oh yes, everything about you is on this card, and you have to present it at certain.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where we're headed.
Yeah.
So the 2050 experiment woke me up in a very significant way, and in fact, the 2050 experiment is what led me to do the Schwartz Report.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I do this daily web publication, the Schwartz Report.
Monitoring important trends.
Monitoring trends that are affecting the future. I don't do news. I don't do polemics. I don't do politics qua politics. I do trends that are shaping the future, because I became fascinated. I am fascinated with these trends and what these remote viewers are telling me. In a way, I kind of regret doing this interview, because I've now sort of polluted the well. I can't do remote viewings with any of the people that...
Well, you can choose a different year.
Yes, that's true, actually. That's a good point.
Yeah, and you know...
That's a very good point. Because I've been thinking, I want to do this again. The problem is that, because I've talked about it, and you have thousands of viewers, I couldn't do 2050 anymore, because I polluted the well.
Yeah.
But if I did 2120,
Yeah. Or you can use a double-blind protocol so that the viewers don't even know.
well, you have to give them the year. So you
You could give them an association of some sort. Say, go to the year that's in the envelope.
Yes, I thought about that.
Mm-hmm.
But there are reasons that I'm not sure that's numinous enough to. I have to think about that one. But I do take your point, because I've been thinking about this.
Because this is a methodology that could be widely applied for futurology.
Well, I got so interested in this that I thought, when I was running Mobius, that I would shift the lab over to just doing this.
Mm-hmm.
But when I talked to people about what I saw coming, they found it so preposterous. Corporations.
Yeah.
They would say to me, it's not going to happen. We have our guys, and we're looking at it, and carbon energy is not going anywhere. So I literally had a number of interviews with corporations in which I showed them the 2050 data and said, I'd like to propose doing this. I can, if you run a lab, you're always looking for funding. And they would say to me, I just don't believe a word of it. That's not what our engineers tell us.
Yeah.
And yet, of course, as we now go along and we get closer and closer to 2050, every one of the major consensual trends that they described has come to play.
Well, Stephen, this has been very enlightening. You're doing such pioneering work. It deserves wide recognition, and I hope this interview helps it to
Thank you.
Achieve that. Thank you for being with me.
All right.
And thank you for being with us.